Hello again. There was considerable unease about the scale of immigration into Britain in the years leading up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. It was a period in Britain's history which may seem eerily familiar to modern readers. A time when a Home Secretary stood up in the House of Commons and admitted that there had, in the last 12 months, been a net migration to the country of 600,000 people. Most of these newcomers were seeking refuge from supposed persecution, people we would today call asylum seekers. He also discussed the possibility that some people were coming to the country for the sole purpose of seeking medical treatment, which today we know as health tourism. The Home Secretary then went on to talk of people smugglers. This MP was, of course, Winston Churchill, who was at that time the Home Secretary. It was a time when another MP complained in the House that at some schools in his constituency, few English pupils are to be found. He claimed that there was a housing crisis caused by immigration. The debates on this subject in Parliament were in response to a deep unease felt by ordinary people about mass immigration. There was particular concern that the influx of unskilled workers from Eastern Europe was driving down wages and making it harder for British workers to find jobs. A far-right group called the British Brotherhood was founded. Their slogan was "England for the English." The crisis over immigration in those days, 1910, which was running at levels which dwarf anything seen today, was compounded by the fear of separate societies developing, communities where many people didn't even speak English. It was thought that not only were all these foreigners taking jobs away from the British, but that fanatical terrorists were being sheltered within such communities, and that bombings and shootings were taking place as a direct consequence of allowing so many foreigners with ideas so different from those traditionally held in Britain to flood the country. The idea that there was once a golden age, when everything was a lot better than it is today, has been popular for thousands of years. Sometimes this supposed golden age is thought to have been centuries ago. For some artists and poets in the 19th century, the 14th century was manifestly a better era than their own. There has in this country, for over a century now, been an enduring belief in one particular golden age which is still thought by many people to have been a special time, a brief era when everything was going well, at least with Britain and the British. This is the Edwardian period, which is usually considered to have lasted from Queen Victoria's death in 1901 to the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914. Calling these years the Edwardian period is something of a misnomer, of course, for Edward VII, after whom the era was named, actually died in 1910. Nevertheless, most historians consider that 1914 marks the end of the Edwardian era. In 21st century Britain, anxieties about immigration and terrorism often centre around Muslims. It is feared that many of them owe their first allegiance not to Britain, but to an unfamiliar religion, which causes them to think and act in very different ways from most British people. Combined with this is a supposed propensity among some Muslims for violence and terrorism. However irrational these feelings might be, they are certainly held by a large section of the population. A century earlier, the fear was of Eastern Europeans, especially Jews, and the way in which they flooded the country and occupied swathes of what we now refer to as the inner cities. They spoke other languages, followed strange religions, some were atheists, and they ate unfamiliar foods. This led to a tendency to form parallel societies and embrace dangerous political ideologies, some of which led to violence. They certainly didn't subscribe to what we now call British values. Perhaps one or two specific instances of the way in which the events in Edwardian society and the fears that such things generated precisely mirror what is going on in Britain today will make this easier to understand. In 2005, an armed robbery in Bradford was bungled disastrously, and a police officer, Sharon Beshenivsky, was shot dead. The crime was carried out by asylum seekers, and some people drew conclusions from this about the wisdom of allowing large numbers of such people to enter the country and remain here as long as they pleased. That the killer was a Muslim did not help matters. There was a general feeling that this was a uniquely horrible crime which was symptomatic of modern society. Surely this kind of thing didn't used to happen in the old days. On Saturday, 23rd of January 1909, a crime almost identical to the murder of Sharon Beshenivsky took place in the North London suburb of Tottenham. Tottenham is today known as an area with many ethnic minorities, not a few of whom are asylum seekers. The situation was no different a century ago, except that at that time most of the asylum seekers were from Poland and Russia, and many of them were Jews. In fact, before the First World War, one part of Tottenham was known as Little Russia, due to the large number of Russians who had settled there. The area had a number of synagogues. On that Saturday morning in 1909, Schnurman's rubber factory in Chestnut Road, just off the high road, was just about to stop work for the weekend. The Saturday was payday and a car arrived from a nearby bank with the wages. No sooner had the clerk got out of the car than two men rushed up and knocked him down and made off with the bag containing £80. Some of the workers from the factory, angry at the prospect of being deprived of their money, gave chase. At the corner of the street, the two robbers turned and opened fire with automatic pistols, wounding one man and sending the others diving for cover. The sound of gunfire brought three police officers running from nearby Tottenham police station. The gunman opened fire on them and the three men sheltered behind a wall. At this point, a 10-year-old boy called Ralph Jocelyn ran out of the house to see what was going on, and he was promptly shot dead. A gun battle broke out because some of the police managed to get revolvers from the police station. The first police officer to catch up with the men was PC William Tyler, and he was shot dead. There followed a chase across Chingford and the fields surrounding the River Lee. Both robbers were asylum seekers from Europe. The fact that both of the killers were Jewish refugees made it a particularly unpleasant case for many people. There was already a lot of anti-Semitism in the country, and this didn't help at all. The popular feeling after what became known as the Tottenham outrage was that these murderous terrorists had been sheltered in a community which had been given refuge in the country and allowed these men to live among them. We see similar comments after crimes by asylum seekers in Britain today. Then followed the siege of Sydney Street, so called, which is probably so familiar that most viewers won't need to be reminded of it. That also involved Jews from Eastern Europe, and it also resulted in more anti-Semitism in Britain. By all of which it will be seen that British fears of being swamped by immigration and of foreign-born terrorists causing havoc on the streets is really nothing new. Today, Muslims have replaced Jews as the menacing foreigners prone to violence. Other than that, the situation was extraordinarily similar in the years leading up to the First World War to what we see today. There never was a golden age of peace and prosperity, and each generation must come to terms with the fact that the world is constantly changing and that their lives will be very different from those of their parents or grandparents. 3,000 years ago, the philosopher whose contemplations were recorded in the Bible as the book of Ecclesiastes wrote, "Never ask why things were so much better in the old days. It's not an intelligent question." Wise advice which many of us might bear in mind today.